Hello everyone and welcome. In this video I shall be sharing my thoughts regarding the first two seasons of Fear the Walking Dead. During the last couple of weeks I've spent the majority of my free time attempting to binge through every episode of Fear the Walking Dead that has been released to date. I've heard so many good things being said about the third season of the show in particular, both by critics and fans alike, so I thought I owed it to myself to try and give the programme another chance. Even though this video does have the word review in the title, I'm not going to be breaking down every single episode of the show, because quite frankly the resulting video would end up being about 5 hours long. Instead, I've just tried to pick out the series' most important events and focused on them. It should be noted that I will be discussing every season individually, and I wrote my script for each season immediately after I finished watching it. So for instance, when I'm talking about Season 2, I haven't yet at that point watched Season 3. I did envision covering all 3 seasons in one video, but I've chosen to split the video over 2 parts. I've done this due to the fact that A, the video would be really long if I covered all 3 seasons in one go, and B, I haven't watched Season 3 yet. I am planning to watch it sometime this week, and you should expect the follow-up video to be posted on my channel hopefully sometime next weekend. There will be spoilers for the entirety of Season 1 and 2 in this video, so it's probably best if you've at least finished the second season of the show first before watching this. I will also be doing more Fear the Walking Dead content in the future, including weekly reviews when the new season starts. But for now, I just want to give you an overview of some of my thoughts so far about the show. So without further ado, let's begin. I made a reference in the video's introduction that I had previously attempted to watch Fear the Walking Dead before. And what I mean by that is a couple of years ago I sat down to watch the pilot episode and I just couldn't get through it. I gave up with it after about half an hour, and until now I hadn't bothered returning to the show. Looking back on how I initially approached the programme, truthfully I don't really feel I gave it a fair chance at all, which is one of the reasons why I decided to give it a second try. Now you have to remember that Fear the Walking Dead first aired after a pretty solid 5th season of The Walking Dead. A season which featured 2 of my favourite storylines in the form of the Hunters and the Claimers. Fear the Walking Dead completely hit the reset button, with the show commencing just before the onset of the Walker outbreak. Characters like Nick and Madison weren't experts at dealing with walkers like Rick and Daryl, and for me it was a hard transition to come from a show in which its characters had learnt so much about the world they'd been forced to live in, to a show where its characters didn't really have a clue what was going on. When I first watched the pilot I found it to be a pretty slow affair, and I'll admit I didn't immediately care for any of the characters the same way I did for Rick Grimes. Although Rick's mission in having to find his family is a pretty cliche setup for a story, it's a cause that most people can get behind. We didn't know an awful lot about Rick during The Walking Dead's first installment, but we found ourselves rooting for him because the idea of a person searching for their loved ones is something that's easy to empathise with. Contrast this to the first character we see on Fear the Walking Dead, Nick, who is presented as a carefree junkie, and it's easy to see why it's so hard to immediately get behind his character the same way we all did for Rick. Although admittedly Nick has grown on me an awful lot. Furthermore, The Walking Dead's pilot focuses almost entirely on Rick, affording the viewer the opportunity to have a chance to bond with him, whereas Fear the Walking Dead's pilot throws a ton of characters at the viewer, giving little time to take an instant liking to any of them. To be honest, I just think I encountered Fear the Walking Dead at the wrong time, and perhaps unfairly kept comparing it to its older brother when I was first watching it. Upon second viewing I found the pilot wasn't actually half bad. Yes, it does have its problems for sure and drags on a bit, but when you take the show as its own entity and accept that it's something different to The Walking Dead, it does become a lot more enjoyable. With that in mind, however, I did find the first season just to be okay. There is a lot I liked about it, but it does stumble through its 6 episodes and makes a lot of mistakes along the way. I found it all to be very stop-start. Things build up in the first 2 episodes with the emergence of walkers and rioting on the streets, only for then things to die down during the next couple of installments before building up once again towards the finale. I will admit the whole army storyline wasn't really something I expected, so on one hand it was kind of a nice surprise. Unfortunately, on the other hand, it did feel like things stagnated when the military rolled into town and set up fences surrounding the street in which the Clarks resided. It's strange to say that a 6-episode season felt prolonged, however the first season did certainly seem to drag its heels in places. Although the army storyline brought things to a grinding halt, I did like how corrupt and evil the US soldiers were portrayed as. Seeing them snatch civilians who they perceived as a threat to move them to their hospital, which actually resembled more of a POW camp, was quite a dark direction for the show to take, and it made for some very interesting viewing. However, one thing I really disliked about the army's appearance was that it felt like I was being taken out of the action, and wasn't seeing the apocalypse unfold in all its gory glory. Nick mentions early on in the season how he finds it strange that no one is acting like what is happening is real, and at times it did feel like the show was ignoring the fact that walkers were now roaming the earth. I didn't really get a sense of the world falling apart because 3 episodes were pretty much spent inside the walls of a military safe zone. I found the characters also left a lot to be desired. I wouldn't really say that I disliked any of them, however none of them really clicked with me, apart from Nick, who ironically, after being the focal point of the first episode, didn't really get enough screen time for the rest of the season. I also found it pretty hard to take Strand seriously. I mean, he was introduced by saying something along the lines of, "Hey, I can sew anything, well, apart from insurance," in this weird attempt to portray him as some kind of badass player, and it just made me feel like I was watching a different show. I don't know if any of my subscribers have played Metal Gear Solid 4, but he reminded me of the game's over-the-top gun launderer Drebin. His mannerisms and the way he spoke were pretty similar, and I was half expecting him to pull out a smoking monkey from his blazer pocket. I have to say I did enjoy the season finale, with the fall of the military base being very well presented. I also liked that the ending set up the prospect of the survivors living on board a boat. I always thought that Kenny's idea of jumping on a boat during Telltale's The Walking Dead game was a pretty interesting plan that sadly never came about, so it was pretty cool having the show set this up to happen in the second season. All in all, the first season was a bit hit and miss. It has some good ideas, and I do like the different approach it took when compared to The Walking Dead. However, it's not a season that I will watch again in any great hurry, and I can definitely see why a lot of people just weren't able to stick with the show through its initial 6 installments. Fear's second season is far from perfect, however it is a vast improvement on the season that came previously. Yes, I feel that it does experience a bit of a slump during the middle section of the season's narrative, however I can look past this thanks to a brilliant opening and a stellar ending. Now, I wrote down in my notes whilst watching the Season 2 premiere that I felt that more happened in the opening 5 minutes of said instalment than the entirety of Season 1, and whilst this is perhaps a tad bit harsh and unfair, I do feel however that the opening segment of Season 2 does more to make it seem like the world has really gone to shit than the entire previous season. Due to its stop-start nature, it never really felt to me that the world was on the brink of collapse during Fear's first 6 episodes. This is a stark contrast to the opening of the Season 2 premiere Munster, which features the cityscape in flames, walkers by the dozen, and our protagonists running for their lives. Immediately I felt that things were taken up a notch compared to Season 1. I mentioned previously how I was looking forward to seeing the survivors traverse the oceans, and the opening story arc which featured the main cast of characters aboard the yacht known as the Abigail certainly delivered. One would probably assume that being on a boat was one of the safer options to take during a zombie apocalypse. However, the show illustrated that things seem to be just as bad amongst the seas as they are on land. The truth is, it doesn't matter where you are in the world of Fear the Walking Dead, you're never too far from opportunists who want to take everything that you have. Connor's group were a prime example of this, and although it was pretty obvious to me that the person Alicia was talking to on the yacht's radio would turn out to be evil, the whole scenario played out really well and went at a brisk pace. Personally, I liked that the story quickly dealt with Connor. I didn't want the altercation with him to turn into another Negan scenario, and what I mean by that is I didn't want Fear to introduce a villain only to then have the protagonist still fighting them 3 years later. Rather than just have the main group of characters fight a comic book bad guy all season, I wanted to see Fear go in different directions, so I'm glad that Fear the Walking Dead did enough to separate itself from its sister show. Instead of having one overarching narrative throughout the entire season, Season 2 was composed of multiple mini-story strands that took our protagonist to different places. Admittedly, not all said story strands worked, but the ones that did made for some great viewing. For me, Chris and Travis's narrative was the highlight of the season. Although the two were only on their own for a couple of episodes, Fear the Walking Dead did a clever job building up Chris's downfall throughout the whole season, without explicitly focusing on him too much. I found Travis to be a bit dull and naive during the first season of the show, and he wasn't really a whole lot better at the start of Season 2, however his time with Chris really helped develop his character and certainly made me more invested in him. It was pretty shocking seeing the guys Chris so desperately craved friendship with kill their injured friend without a care in the world. I mean, he wasn't even bitten, the guy was suffering from a gunshot wound and could have made a full recovery. Chris really should have listened to his father, as it was a fate that would also befall him. I've mentioned before in one of my old videos that I'm not the most animated person when it comes to watching TV shows. However, when Travis was alone with Brandon and Derek, the two dudes who murdered his son, I was shouting at my TV in the hope that he would go full Rick Grimes on the pair of them. And go full grimy he did, as Travis embraced his animal instincts and beat the both of them to death. Although admittedly it wasn't pleasant to watch, I was pleased to see Travis finally cross the line when it comes to killing and do what he had to do. I understand that to those who haven't watched the show, the Chris and Travis narrative might not sound like the most interesting. I mean, to summarise, it essentially boils down to seeing Travis trying to teach his son right from wrong, only for his son to reject this. His son then goes off with some strangers, the strangers kill him, and his dad kills the strangers. Compared to Rick's past fight against the governor or his current battle versus Negan, there certainly weren't as huge stakes at play. However, this really worked to its advantage. You see, not everything has to revolve around a big bad guy trying to ruin everything. Sometimes a smaller scale story can actually be more affecting and compelling to watch, and the Chris and Travis story arc certainly was. As I alluded to previously, however, not all the mini storylines within Fear's second season were as good as the one that focused on Chris and Travis. For example, the whole Celia plotline just didn't do it for me at all. It felt like the show came to a standstill once the protagonist left the Abigail for Strand's country hideout, and for me Celia just felt like a Mexican cousin of The Walking Dead's Herschel during his farming days. I know that The Walking Dead has covered a lot of different ideas and themes throughout its runtime, so I do understand that it may be difficult for Fear to come up with completely new and original storylines constantly. However, there really was no need to have a story arc centered on a lady who believed that walkers shouldn't be killed, considering The Walking Dead had nearly an entire season centered around this idea. In addition, I also felt that Nick's time at the Colonia was a bit dull, although as time went on I did find the community growing on me. Finally, having to sit through Madison's attempt to fortify a hotel again wasn't really something that I cared for. With that in mind though, I did like the setup for the fall of the hotel. Seeing the father of a bride die only to then be reanimated and take a chunk out of his daughter on her wedding day was one of the best horror moments the Walking Dead franchise on a whole has produced. I also enjoyed the episode Do Not Disturb, which featured Elena and Alicia working together to survive the infected who had overrun the hotel. There were good moments to be found at this setting, however I often found myself wishing for Madison, Strand and Alicia to be somewhere more interesting, and I was glad when they did finally decide to leave the area come the end of the season. Personally, my favourite moments of Fear the Walking Dead's second season were to be found when characters were on the move. When the protagonist started to settle down at different camps, I found my interest started to wane. As previously mentioned, I did enjoy the episodes set aboard the Abigail and the Chris and Travis storyline the most. However, I do think a special mention needs to be said for the mid-season premiere Grotesque, as it quickly became one of my favourite episodes of Fear the Walking Dead. The entire episode centres on Nick as he takes off on his own after Celia's place is burnt to the ground by Daniel. What follows is almost like an episode of a Bear Grylls TV show, as Nick finds himself alone in the desert. He first tries to drink some cactus juice and then his own piss before he is attacked by some wild dogs. He also comes into contact with some gang members and spends a good chunk of time walking amongst the dead. Yes, it might not sound like the most riveting hour of TV, but for me zombie survival shows are at their best when we as a viewer have to witness the characters, well, having to survive. I get why people may have been annoyed at this episode when it aired. I mean, it did show immediately after the mid-season finale and didn't feature any of the other main characters, leaving everyone hanging until the next installment. However, I feel that when taken on its own, it's a brilliant entry to the series. Now that I've covered most of the major plot points during Fear's second season, I want to quickly mention my feelings towards the show's main characters. All in all, I found the protagonists to be much more likeable and convincing than they were in the initial season. Strand, who I found to be a bit of an oddball when he was first introduced, is 100 times better in season 2. I like how the show convinces the viewer that he could be hiding something nasty from the group during the first 2 or 3 episodes, only for him just to be hiding his relationship with his partner. I certainly didn't trust him when he was sneaking off making phone calls, and in fact when one of Connor's followers shot the dinghy he was in causing it to deflate, I actually wanted Strand to die because I thought he was a danger to the group. Thankfully, Strand survived because he turned out to be one of the best characters on the show, as well as one of the funniest. The writers threw a real curveball with him, and I have to say it paid off. I just hope he reunites with the group in season 3. Nick also came off as a much better character this time around. Sure, at times he is too easily swayed by those around him. I mean, he fell for Celia's bullshit after only knowing her for a couple of days. However, for the most part, I do always enjoy it when he's on screen. I like the fact that he's unpredictable and it makes sense given his background story. Even before the world went to shit, Nick was living day by day, never knowing where he would be when he woke up, or if in fact come the next day, if he would even wake up at all. So in a sense, not a lot has changed for him. Where others see the world in ruins and become distraught and terrified, Nick's world has always been chaos, so for him this is all the same. You get a sense that he is enjoying going on his little adventure and that he really does belong in the messed up world he finds himself in. He is also a lot more intelligent than perhaps he gets credit for. He was arguably the reason the people of La Colonia made it out alive, even if they did eventually end up getting shot at by what appears to be the US military. I'm also fond of the fact that Nick almost constantly covers himself in walker blood since he discovered it allows him to blend in with the walkers. I've always felt that Kirkman's notion of the living not being able to be detected by walkers if they had the same scent as them to be a pretty cool idea. However, I've always found it a bit strange that the characters in The Walking Dead use it so seldomly. I mean, Rick discovers this little trick in the show's second episode, but then doesn't bother to use it again until 6 seasons later. Nick on the other hand smothers himself in blood nearly every time he ventures out, which is pretty damn clever if you ask me. Yes, I know that Gabe is currently ill due to doing the same thing, but this is the only time on The Walking Dead this has happened to any of its characters. So in my mind, the pros of using walker blood as camouflage outweigh the cons. Lastly, whilst I'm on the character front, I want to mention Alicia, who I feel develops into one of the show's stronger leads. When characters around her are making dumb decisions, she is usually the voice of reason. When Madison told her she wanted to find Nick, Alicia quite rightly asked her why she was so intent on looking for someone who abandoned her. Of course, I can understand why Madison would want to find her son, but it's nice to see a character in Alicia who seems to think logically and tell it like it is. Furthermore, I was happy she also crossed the line when it came to killing, as she stabbed one of the bad guys attempting to kill Travis. I'm hoping she could be a real badass character in Season 3. So to summarise, Fear the Walking Dead Season 2 isn't without its problems. The middle section of the season especially is quite slow, as it has the main characters spend time in places that sadly just aren't that interesting. However, when the show is good, it's really good, with the most enticing parts of the story to be found when its various characters are travelling on the road or on the sea. I also believe that the characters are a lot more defined and likeable than the first season, and on the whole I found it to be a pretty solid 15 instalments. I just hope the third season can live up to all the hype. So there you have it, that's my thoughts on the first 2 seasons of Fear the Walking Dead. Please let me know your thoughts below, and please don't spoil the third season for me. Like I said at the start of the video, I'm going to try and blast through the third season this week, and then hopefully I'll share my thoughts with you next weekend. Until then though, as always, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.